while you cannot give this to the beginning students, you must evolve some way in your own consciousness as to how and when to introduce this. There are two major contributions that have been made to the world through the infinite way. One does away with God and a belief in God and a faith in God and a hope in God as God. But reveals instead that the illumined consciousness of the individual is the God. When an individual has the mind that was in Christ Jesus, they have the God mind. And when they do not have the mind that was in Christ Jesus, they do not have the God mind, and they have no God. For there is no God separate and apart from the illumined consciousness of an individual. The unillumined consciousness of the individual is not God, but there is no God except the illumined consciousness of the individual. And this agrees with Buddhism, in that there is no God separate and apart from the individual, but that the individual has God in proportion as they have the Buddha mind, the illumined mind. Now, once we know that God constitutes individual consciousness, then God is the consciousness of the individual. Then the consciousness of the individual is as God. And how much God does he have? As much as he can accept and become aware of. He can have a little bit of God, and he can have a whole lot of God, and eventually he can have the whole of the mind that was in Christ Jesus if he can keep on developing to that point. Therefore, we come back to this in the Infinite Way teaching, that anything you can think about God cannot be God, because it's only an idea in your mind, and an idea in your mind cannot be God. A concept in your mind cannot be God, because whatever is in your mind is an effect, and it is the thinker that is the cause of that effect. Therefore, if there is a God, it has to be the thinker, but not the human thinker. Oh no, the illumined mind of the individual. So that our attainment isn't finding a God. Our attainment is developing our individual consciousness to its Christhood, or some degree thereof. It is true that no individual can undertake this except by the grace of God, because without the grace of God he has no interest in it. The things of the Spirit are foolishness with man. Therefore, there is no use trying to develop spiritually the person who does not hunger and thirst after it within themselves. And they themselves give some indication of the degree of their hungering and thirsting and their appreciation of what it is that they're seeking. Now, when the spark touches an individual and awakens him, not merely to being healed by God, that's merely saying I can't be healed medically and so I'm willing to be healed spiritually, as we often receive in letters, that I don't think it makes any difference whether we're healed materially or spiritually, but being healed spiritually is easier, and I think they mean less expensive. But it does make a difference. It doesn't make a difference if all we're trying to attain is our health. But to the person seeking illumination, there is no God to heal them now any more than there was a God to heal them yesterday or the day before yesterday. If there is a God to heal you tomorrow, there must have been a God to heal you yesterday, and where was it? Therefore, the healing agency is the illumined consciousness of an individual, and if you go to Jesus, you'll probably have an instantaneous healing. And if you go to the disciples, most of them, you might have a very good healing. And so with us, if you come to us, you go to one, you'll have far better healings than going to some of the others. And the difference isn't in God, the difference is in the degree of illumination of the individual. Now, this is one of the major contributions of the infinite way to the world, to stop the seeking after a God and start to realize that what we are seeking is illumination. Then the next question comes up: of what does illumination consist? What do we mean by illumination or illumined consciousness? How do we attain it? What constitutes it? And here again you have the second contribution, major contribution of the infinite way to this world. An illumined consciousness, and it states this all the way back in the book The Infinite Way, is the state of consciousness that does not hate, fear, or love error in any form. That is illumination. That is Christ consciousness or spiritual consciousness or the Buddha mind. When consciousness is awakened to the realization that since God is too pure to behold iniquity, then individual consciousness must be lifted to that place in consciousness where it is too pure to behold iniquity, and it does not have evil to overcome, rise above, or destroy. Illumined consciousness is that state of consciousness which is always at rest in the realization that there is my kingdom and that this is my kingdom. This is only this world when you have two powers. Then it becomes this world. It isn't a second world, it's an imaginary world held in our mind. And in the degree that we have only one power, one presence, one cause, one effect, one reality, in that degree are we illumined, and in that degree does this world be overcome. Now remember, you are of this world when you judge by appearances. You are the unillumined mind when you see sin, disease, death, lack, and limitation as something to be overcome, as powers. You are the illumined consciousness. You have attained in some degree the mind that was in Christ Jesus, the Buddha mind. When you have perceived inwardly that all appearances are illusory appearances, they are not forms, conditions, or persons, but they are states of illusion. Because once you recognize this, you can be obedient to the Master's revelation. Resist not evil. Put up thy sword. You are not illumined when you have to take up the physical sword or the mental sword, or when you have to protect yourself from the evils of this world. Now, Once you have perceived that individual illumined consciousness is Christhood, you have nothing further to do. Christhood does it all. Once you perceive the nature of individual consciousness as omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence. Ah, yes, but in the beginning you are telling your students that God is omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. You are telling the students that the nature of God is omniscience, and that is why you do not have to pray to it or tell it anything. And you are teaching the student that God is omnipotence, and that is why there is no evil, because God is the only power. But as you reach the teacher-practitioner consciousness, you yourself must know that the God you're talking about is my consciousness. In my consciousness, there is nothing to be influenced or taught or used, no powers to be used, because my consciousness is itself omniscience. It knows my need, and so forth and so on. So that when you understand God as individual consciousness, you will understand why I and my Father are one, and all that the Father hath is mine, because all that God is my consciousness, and my consciousness embodies the Godhood. And as you go back over the writings now, you will see that every book has this and reveals it, but that you cannot understand it until at a certain point in your evolutionary experience it hits you and you say, oh, whereas before I was blind, now I see. And from then on you begin to relax. Now, let us see this in operation. Resurrection, and this is from the book, The Contemplative Life. And it's the across the desk in the chapter Contemplative Meditation. Resurrection, in its mystical sense, means resurrecting the Son of God out of the tomb of the physical senses. That must be clear, then, that we're born into the physical senses. We're thinking through the human mind only. And resurrection means lifting up the Son of God in us until the Son of God is our mind, not the physical senses. It is also resurrection in the sense of rising out of the physical sense of body. Ah, yes, but when the Son of God is raised up in us, then we have a more spiritual sense of body and this universe, into the realization of spiritual consciousness as governing all form. Now, where have we left God? See that? Spiritual consciousness becomes God in action. Your spiritual consciousness, my spiritual consciousness, the spiritual consciousness of the individual who has attained it. The revelation of life lived by grace, instead of under the law, consists of the revelation of the consciousness of the individual as a law of resurrection, healing, protection to the body, business, home, and well-being in every form. And we begin to see how consciousness, the consciousness of the individual, even without taking thought and without being directed, becomes the law of harmony unto our experience. Here in this brief passage is the whole secret. Now, let us say in 1946 that Joel was the only person who had caught these two principles under the name of infinite way. And in 1947, it was produced in a book. Now, the human way of introducing that to the world would be to get a publisher and advertise and to give lectures and invite the press to hear it and report on it and send out free copies to ministers and to so forth and so on, and project it into the human mind. Of course, there would be, as there is to this book by the bishop in England, there would be opposition and there would be persecution and there would almost be excommunication. But in time, consciousness would begin to absorb it. Or there is the way that was taught to me, which has nothing to do with those things. Sit in your home and wait for somebody to come to you. And eventually 3 people came to me by automobile from Ohio to California of their own will and accord. And then there came 4 married couples in California. And then there came a couple more and a couple more and so on. Then came an invitation to speak to a unity group. And then came an invitation to speak to a Ernest Holmes group. All came. None was sought. I obeyed my orders to stay in my home. This was just a repetition of my first experience in Christian Science in Boston, when for a year I did not attend a Christian Science church service or a lecture or visit the home of a Christian Science or have a Christian Scientist in my home. But I got up in the morning, did my meditations, went to my office, returned to my home late in the afternoon, and indulged no human footstep. And one by one they were led to the door, and so that evolved. And so this was a second experience of that same nature. And then, not I, but another metaphysical teacher sent a copy of The Infinite Way to Henry Thomas Hamblin in England. And it hit him so hard that he wrote an article called The Infinite Way, published it in his magazine, without asking me, without writing me, without considering me. And the response was so tremendous and the demand for the book so big that George Allen and Unwin of London wrote to me and asked, could they publish it? In the end, Harper sent for me. Then Mr. Zeppos of the Julian Press flew out to Chicago when we were there and went away with 4 books at once. Do you see how it has all come? A pathway has been beaten to the doorstep, right? Without a human act. Never have I gone to a city or a church or any place except when I was invited. Never, under any circumstances, have I asked anybody, could I speak for them or could I present my message? No. And even when I have been invited, I have asked, are you sure you know what this message consists of? My first invitation to a New Thought group in Portland, Oregon was refused, and I asked the leader of that conference to be sure to read The Infinite Way again and make certain that he wanted it, because it was contrary to their teachings, and in spite of that, he wanted it. Now, behind that is this principle, that if God poured this message into my consciousness, it could not have been to make me healthy, wealthy, and wise. God could not have been considering doing me a favor. It was really not being poured into my consciousness as an individual. It was being poured into human consciousness, and I was sufficiently attuned and prepared to receive it. But if God was pouring this into human consciousness, then God must also be preparing other consciousnesses to receive it. And so God, in his mysterious way, and it is a mysterious way, brings all of these things about that have now established this worldwide and now is bringing it into the church, and so forth and so on. Well, I suppose that one of the greatest thrills that I have ever had in my lifetime came this week, when one of our students sent me a pamphlet or a leaflet on the subject of the fact that we do not have to go out into the world to establish liberty and freedom for the world. That you do not gain anything by crusading for a good cause. That if you sit at home, the world will be led to your doorstep to receive that which you have. And it was a whole exposition of the very experience that has happened as the message of the infinite way. That if freedom is a divine idea and it is established in your consciousness, don't go out and try to give it to anyone. They can't receive it. Let them come to you. Oh, it was marvelous. Do you see? Now, all of this means then that the consciousness which is God is nothing while it's floating around in air. It is only when the consciousness which is God becomes the consciousness of an individual that it functions on our level of life. Therefore, as truth becomes my consciousness and I abide in it, it touches you. It reaches you somewhere. And you are drawn to it. Now, humanly, I couldn't do that. I remember that the human thing that brought Daisy was a neighbor being sick and wanting to go and not being able to go alone. That's a funny way to make it operate, isn't it? And Daisy caught it, and the student who brought her didn't. And I can remember your trips to Hawaii, okay, which I couldn't have brought about, could I? But that divine consciousness, without action on my part, without human, oh God, go out and get somebody. See that? Sitting, abiding. That brought you several times. Do you see? It found these people. Now, if you could know the hundreds of ways that I know of that people have come to us, not only that they might be blessed, but that we might be blessed. I can tell you the story of a woman who was dying in California, had been given up by the doctor, and she made her estate over to her relatives so that to save a little taxes for them. And a neighbor of hers came in one day and said to the nurse, I have a book here that I can't understand, and I know it must be beautiful. Maybe you'd like to read it to your patient. And she gave her a copy of The Infinite Way. And the nurse read it to the patient, and the next night the patient was out of bed on the telephone, and on Monday that patient was in Portland, Oregon for 3 weeks of classwork, day and night classwork with me. Went back. She was 79 years of age at the time. She lived 6 more years in beautiful health, passed on, and then there was $5,000 cash left in her will to the Infinite Way for its activities. Nothing human happened there. Do you see that? The will of God was made manifest in these particular ways, right? So it is. We have no way of knowing how God acts, But I do know the way or means by which it acts, and that is this, that actually there is only one consciousness. And therefore, as each individual lifts themselves, they reach the consciousness that can bless them and which they can bless. It has to be two-way, otherwise it cannot operate. So that if I have been given by grace this wisdom, all those in the world who are saying, "Oh God, isn't there some help? Oh God, isn't there a way? Oh God, where are you?" They must eventually find me. Oh, they will find me as Joel when that need exists, but they don't have to. They can now find me as Infinite Way Books, or they can now find me as the teachers, because they are all the same consciousness. So whether they find me as Joel or find you as you and you and you, they're still finding me, capital M. They're finding that which they sought. They are finding God awareness. So they could be led to Joel at first when he's the only means. Then they could be led to the books. Then they could be led to the teachers and practitioners. But they would still be being led to me, because out of my consciousness has this evolved. Now, it is in the same way that every teacher and every practitioner must be careful not to be a proselyter, not to become a book salesman from the standpoint of just selling books. It's a fine line that has to be drawn, because you must be ready to place the books where they will do the right good. You must be ready to prepare them, and yet not just be a book salesman. In the same way, you are presenting the opportunity to students to come to you for instruction or healing, and those who have centers are presenting these centers and tapes and books and meetings and classes. On the other hand, you must be careful not to be soliciting for them, not to be proselyting for them, nor trying to hold students to them. Just remember this: if a student wants to come today, our function is to give whatever we can. If they don't want to come tomorrow, that's not our business. They are evolving according to their light. We may present a lesson to them, but we have no right to compel them to study it. We can present tape meetings to them, but we have no right to urge it upon them or compel them to attend. We are merely there as a light. It's up to them to what extent they wish to avail themselves of that light. Then you will find that those who are hungry and thirsting after truth will avail themselves of it to the greatest degree. And the others you can do nothing about. This we find in the healing ministry. How many people there are who have wonderful healings and then write and say thank you, and they're not interested in another thing until they need another healing. Well, there's no use of trying to tell them that you are wasting your life, that sooner or later this thing isn't going to work for you. They have to find that out for themselves. Let us agree that we have the pearl of great price, for we have. And that pearl is the awareness that God constitutes individual consciousness, my consciousness and your consciousness, the world consciousness. Not that everyone is aware of God as their consciousness, but that is what they have to eventually wake up to. If they're going to search for God, the end of the search comes when they know that God constitutes their consciousness, that God is not to be found in holy mountains or holy temples or in Jerusalem or Rome or Boston, that God is to be found only as individual consciousness, yours and mine. In proportion as we become aware of God as our consciousness, we are illumined. That is our great pearl. But our great pearl has another side too. And that is that this illumination, which reveals God as our individual consciousness, also reveals that the nature of our consciousness is omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. Therefore, I do not have to pray to my consciousness in the sense of telling it anything, trying to influence it, trying to buy it or its favors. I have to relax in it, because God's thoughts are not my thoughts. There is no way that my thoughts could influence God or tell God. Therefore, to accept my consciousness as omniscience means that I must sit in the silence and the stillness and let my consciousness speak to me through the still small voice, or the thundering voice that makes the earth melt. But the point is that I am illumined in proportion as I know that I do not have to seek outside myself, nor do I have to tell God, importune God, beg, plead, praise God, bribe God, influence God, tithe God, because God is omniscience. Therefore, my contact with God is the attitude of listening. Furthermore, my pearl consists of the fact that God is omnipotence. Therefore, I need no God powers. I'm not seeking a God because there is no evil for God to overcome. What I am doing is becoming a state of receptivity so that the still small voice can utter itself through me, and this is the establishment of peace on earth, individually and collectively, not by praying to God to do away with wars and tyrants, but by letting our divine consciousness manifest itself through the still small voice, through silence. We do not tell God where to go, what country to go to, what tyrant or politician to handle. We do not tell God of the evils of this world and then ask Him to do something about it. We abide in stillness and let the imprisoned splendor escape through the still small voice. Since God is omnipotence, it has no powers to overcome or destroy. It merely has to be allowed an inlet and an outlet to this universe, and then the evils of this world are dissolved because they do not exist as powers or realities, but as maya or illusion or illusory concepts produced by the belief in two powers. Again, our pearl consists of the awareness that God is omnipresence as my very consciousness, so that the place whereon I stand is always holy ground. If I go up to heaven, it is holy ground. If I make my bed in hell, it is holy ground. If I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, it is holy ground, because I and my consciousness are one. My consciousness and God consciousness are one. God constitutes my very consciousness, even in the midst of sin, disease, death, lack, or limitation, and my awareness of this dissolves the pictures of sense, the erroneous appearances to which we have reacted. Now we behold the appearances and no longer react to them because of our understanding of their illusory nature, of the non-power. Therefore, we come eventually to the greatest revelation that has been given to this world by the infinite way, and that is the nature of spiritual power. Here we reach the top, the nature of spiritual power. Spiritual power cannot be used. Spiritual power cannot be used by man, it cannot be influenced by man, it cannot be controlled by man, and man cannot make it do something. Spiritual power is that which operates through the still small voice to govern man. As we individually open our consciousness to the Christ government, spiritual power, it governs us individually, but it doesn't limit itself to governing us individually. Every time it comes to us, it is also released in human consciousness, so that even in a generation it can change so many facets of the consciousness of mankind. It is that which is permeating the earth today. It doesn't mean that 4 billion people will have to individually awaken to the Christ. It means that the 10 righteous men are admitting the Christ into human consciousness, and eventually there will be no human consciousness left. Because as the new generations are born, they will be born into a higher consciousness which is now established on earth. They will not go through the experiences of their parents. It is for this reason that the spiritual power which is now being released on earth will be the consciousness of the new generation. They will not be born into their parents' consciousness. And you can witness that in the experience of some of the children of today who are not going through the mistakes of their parents. Now, there are many facets of this that indicate how this spiritual consciousness is permeating human consciousness. I was invited to give the main talk, at a banquet given to the Boy Scout leaders of Hawaii. Not the Boy Scouts, but the Boy Scout leaders. And the concluding talk of the evening was given by a judge on the bench here, federal judge. And he said that he had had a talk in preparation for this tour with the judge in Hawaii who is on the bench for all of the juvenile cases in the juvenile court. Because he said he had had an experience in his judgeship, and he wanted to know that if a judge handling only juveniles had had any similar experience. And he found that he had. This is the experience. That boys who have had Boy Scout training, in all the history of these two judges, only one boy had ever been brought before them. And that boy has been healed and restored to society. This judge sitting on the bench here in Hawaii does not have the case of a juvenile delinquent brought before him of a boy who has had Boy Scout training. Does not this indicate how spiritual consciousness is permeating human consciousness? See that? And I'm sure that eventually we will have a whole race of people among whom will be no delinquents. Because if there can be so few or none in the Christian Science movement or the Unity movement, and so few or none in the Boy Scouts, and probably the same would be found in the YMCAs and the YWCAs, then you can certainly see that all of mankind is subject to that, if only that influence is brought to bear. But that influence is being brought to bear because consciousness is being permeated with this Christian Science and unity and infinite way and so forth and so on. But much more so now, when we have God as individual consciousness and when we have God not as a power over other powers. All of this is like putting the capstone on top of the building, putting the seal on the thing. It completes the picture of spiritual power. And when it is known, now everyone has always known that if only you could get spiritual power, you could overcome the troubles of the world. But the trouble is, they have always sought a spiritual power that could be used. And there is no such thing. There is a spiritual power to which you can submit yourself. And that is the power of your consciousness, when your consciousness no longer fears or hates or loves error in any form. These things must be brought out in your classes. Now, in the first 2 tapes that have been made for this purpose, you will find the steps leading up to this. And be sure that the students get plenty of that before they are led up to this, because this would not make sense to a beginner. We could see how difficult that was in presenting the idea to ministers that God cannot be prayed to. They get sick. It shocks them. Or that God did not cause death or disease or accidents. That the will of God is only good. These things must be led up to. Give the milk of the word to the babes and the meat. But the teacher, like the practitioner in the office with one patient, must be the judge of how to lead that. You can't write a book about how to lead your students because you're dealing with individual consciousness, and each individual has a different background. Therefore, the practitioner in the office with one patient or student must take that patient or student where they find them. Not where we'd like them to be, but where they are. And then gradually lead them from there into whatever height of understanding their fitness prepares them, enables them to go. Then in the same way, in giving classes, start always with a beginner's class. If anyone wants to enroll in it the second time, they may, but with the understanding that they are going to hear that same state of evolution, not always presented in the same way, because you never can present a class the same way twice. But always, in those beginners' classes, the work as it is outlined on the first 2 tapes must be included so that The students learn the nature of the 1959 work as impersonalization and nothingization. The greatest problem that I have in my mail with patients and students is that they do not grasp the 1959 work. Somehow or other, it's always a person that's brought up, or a condition, or a series of events. And they do not seem to grasp the fact that we are not dealing with persons, but dealing with appearances which we understand to be of the nature of illusion. Now, since it takes years and years before patients and students can grasp that point, that we are dealing with universal beliefs, not with persons or conditions, it is the practitioner or teacher who must be so evolved that no matter who comes or what, there is the recognition, wait a minute, this is not a person or a condition I'm meeting. This is that universal antichrist or hypnotism, and in the recognition of that, I'm done with it. Illumination consists of knowing that. No one has evolved spiritually who is still trying to reform people or heal people or remove sins or diseases until there is that evolved consciousness that refuses to take person into their treatment or prayer or meditation and say, wait a minute, I have nothing to do with thee. Get thee behind me, Satan. I'm dealing with a temptation to accept appearances. So you see, the major responsibility is on the practitioner or teacher. That doesn't mean that you can guarantee that every patient is going to be healed or taught, because they also can have a wall up there that refuses to let you in if they keep on insisting that it's person or condition or so forth. If they do not yield, which they must eventually yield, or they are not going to make it. And I have lots of patients with whom I've been working as many as 12 years that will not catch it, do not catch it, and do not get their healing. And just for my own satisfaction, some of these I've asked Lorraine to work on, some I've asked Daisy to work on, but nothing happens with them any more than with me. And the reason is, I'm not at fault, Daisy's not at fault, Lorraine is not at fault. They are holding that wall up that insists that this is person, or this is me, or this is the other fellow, or so forth and so on. We just cannot break through. In most cases, there is a yielding sooner or later. But we are not illumined, except in the proportion as we have impersonalized and no longer are blaming persons for their troubles, regardless of what they may be. Of course, they have to awaken to this sooner or later. But even while we're waiting for them to awaken, we in the back of our mind must say, at least I am awake. I am not holding you in bondage. This is not person. This is still universal hypnotism. And then dropping it, because the minute you start to work against universal hypnotism, you have taken up the sword. That automatically leads to a whole new consciousness of prayer. Because now when you sit down to pray, and the first word that comes into your mind is omniscience, there has to be a smile. What have I got to say to the all-knowing? And then, well, then what am I here for? Because the omniscience is the omnipotence. And this is the all-power. So I'm certainly not here to get any power to do anything to some other power. And this omnipotence is omnipresence. So I don't have to go anywhere for that. And when I'm through with that, prayer becomes now, speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. And in that attitude and altitude of prayer, that which is necessary comes through. It may not come through in any way that we are aware of at the moment, but it won't be long before we'll see the fruitage. And then we'll say, the presence did go before me to make the crooked places straight. Omnipotence is omnipotence. That which was the other power isn't around. And the fact that your patients may live in this city or 1,000 miles away, it dawns on you, omnipresence is the truth. The truth I knew in my consciousness was powerful in Cincinnati, Chicago, Cleveland, London, South Africa. So therefore, my consciousness must be omnipresence in Africa. See that? The omnipotence, which is my consciousness, is made manifest in Europe, Asia, Africa. Therefore, it is my consciousness that is omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. And it is a consciousness which does not have to be manipulated by human thought or power, but rather in quietness and in confidence, letting it manifest itself. Therefore, all we have to do is sit quietly in a room and know this truth. And it must function in what is called this world. So that in our world work, again you must see that your consciousness is a power. But it must be consciously realized. And in our present state of development, it has to be a specific activity. In other words, when the threat of war goes up, or the threat of strikes, or the threat of infection or contagion, it is at that moment that we must specifically turn within. It won't be necessary in the ages to come, when Christ will be individual consciousness. Then there'll be no ground for infection, contagion, war, hate to operate. But as long as there is a human consciousness in which the illusions of sense can operate, the 10 righteous men have to sit down and pray. And they must pray specifically at the time when this thing touches their consciousness. In the absolute, it would be enough to say that God constitutes individual consciousness, but that won't do anything. It's when God is individual consciousness universally that the Christ government will be on earth. Now, to some extent, the fact that we have recognized God as individual consciousness, and that we have recognized in some extent that spiritual power doesn't destroy anything and it can't be used, it dispels illusions, in that degree we individually must be Christ-governed, God-governed. But in our individual realization of it, we bring it to God's government on earth as it is in heaven, as a totality. So it is for this reason that in your community, when you are made aware by any means whatsoever of impending discord, there is this need for immediate work. Now, the balance of the time, your world work must include the other side of the stick. Neither must I be fooled by good weather or good health or good supply, but I must consciously realize that I'm not aiming toward good supply or good health or good government. I am concerned only with the middle path. Christ harmony, Christ supply, Christ weather, so forth and so on. Always watch as a teacher or practitioner that you do not get hooked onto rejoicing in good humanhood, but that you always remember you are in the middle path. You are not here to change bad humanhood into good humanhood. You are to realize Christhood. And this constitutes our great pearl. For nowhere and in no teaching in the world does it exist but the infinite way at this time. That we are treading the middle path, not trying to crusade for good human government, not trying to just heal people of their physical ills, not merely trying to get people to stop being alcoholics, because that's the other side of the same stick. So that part of our pearl is the realization that we are not trying to attain good humanhood, but be more and more aware of Christhood. Now you see, you will have cause in your meditations to think over these pearls of the infinite way, that which really constitutes what we have that is beyond price. This will enable you to see why it can't be bought, why rich people can't hire you to keep them healthy, wealthy, and wise. Oh, there was a time when practitioners accepted patients at so much a month to give them a treatment every day for protective work, for supply, for health. And these people were buying it. Well, I've seen too often what happens. One of my friends for more than 20 years paid a practitioner $30 a month. And then he had a heart attack and was taken to the hospital, and she wouldn't treat him because he was in a hospital. You can't buy protection. You can't buy health. When people express gratitude, if they have any idea at all that they're buying God's favors or spiritual good, they might just as well keep their money. What is paid out in this work or given out in this work is pure gratitude. But if anyone has an idea that with that gratitude they're buying something, they're all wrong. This cannot be purchased except by blood, sweat, and tears. Nights of the soul. Dark nights, some of them. Because these truths that are brought forth from consciousness are not floating around in consciousness for anybody and everybody to pick up. There have been too few who have caught them in the whole history of the world, and those few have been on the cross in one way or another. If you wish to bring forth pearls of wisdom from your consciousness, you'll pay the price. But it won't be dollars. The dollars you give will be the measure of your gratitude for what has happened. What is on this tape so far should provide at the very least 6 advanced lessons for individuals or groups, because this much could not be handed out to students at one time. Only those who have spent years and years not just reading the books, but living with them, studying them, meditating on them, they could take this in one session. But even they would have to go over it several times to have it brought into consciousness. But the student you are teaching, this should be 6 lessons, and then there should be at least 2 lessons of summary, and then probably even a final lesson of realization, because this is advanced work beyond anything that has yet been given in the infinite way. Thank you.